try not to cry, because what you are about to hear is not just a story, but a lesson in humility, courage, and truth. And if you are in the USA or the UK listening right now, I want you to pause for a second and think about every time someone underestimated you because of how you looked, where you came from, or the way you spoke. And then imagine what it feels like when the same people who laughed are forced to stand in silence, ashamed, as you rise higher than they ever thought possible. That is the story of a young black girl who walked into an Ivy League debate tournament where polished stars of elite schools laughed at her before she opened her mouth. But by the end of the night, those same stars had their pride torn to shreds. And if you want to see more stories like this, real battles, real justice, real victories, then smash that subscribe button right now because you do not want to miss the next story that will shake your soul. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The auditorium smelled of polish and power. Velvet curtains pulled back on a stage where banners of Ivy League universities hung like reminders of who truly owned the space, or at least who thought they did. And in that sea of tailored suits and expensive watches, in that hum of laughter and arrogance, stood Amara, 17 years old, skin glowing deep brown under the stage lights, eyes sharp, but shoulders heavy from the mocking smirks around her, because the other debaters had already decided she was a joke. She was not from their world, not from their private schools, not from their legacy names carved into the history of universities older than entire countries. No. She was from the South Side, from a public school that struggled to keep the lights on, and yet here she was, holding a folder full of notes written at her kitchen table where the lamp flickered and her younger siblings fought for space on the same table to do homework, her mother watching late into the night while sewing clothes to make extra money. But none of those judges, none of those competitors knew that backstory. They only saw her thrift store blazer, one size too big, and her shoes slightly worn at the heels. And that was enough for them to laugh, whisper, and bet she would choke. But Amara did not choke. She stood silent, scanning the room, remembering every single insult that had been thrown her way during the mixer the night before when a boy with slick hair from Yale had told her maybe she should start in community debate clubs before aiming too high, and a Harvard girl with perfect teeth had said she must have been invited to check off some diversity box, and the laughter that followed had burned itself into Amara's memory, fueling a fire she carried with her onto that stage. Because what they did not know was that she had spent years studying not just arguments but the psychology of arrogance, not just facts but the rhythm of storytelling, and she had a gift. Her voice carried a weight that pierced through noise, her words arranged like music, her pauses deliberate, and though her hands trembled slightly when the first round began, her eyes locked on the panel of judges with a focus so sharp it startled even them. And when she spoke, the laughter died. Instantly, because she opened not with statistics or jargon, but with a question that sliced through the air. What is the worth of truth when only the wealthy are allowed to define it? Silence spread across the auditorium, and suddenly the girl they dismissed became a mirror, reflecting all of their hidden fears. Because if someone like her, from a place they ignored, could outshine them here, what did that say about their pride, their privilege, their so-called superiority? The first round ended with scattered applause, not thunderous yet, but enough to make the debaters exchange uneasy glances, and Amara returned to her seat, clutching her folder, pretending not to notice the judge who scribbled furiously after. She spoke, or the Yale boy whose smirk had begun to falter, but she noticed everything. She noticed how the air shifted, how whispers of doubt began to replace laughter, how her presence had already disrupted the unspoken order, and as she sat there, heart pounding, she knew she had only just begun, because what she had in store for them in the next rounds would not just win a debate, it would dismantle an entire culture of arrogance piece by piece until their Ivy League pride lay in tatters before her. The second round was the real test, the one where the debate stars believed they would crush her because the motion was technical. layered with policy jargon and economic theory, the kind of topic they had been prepped for by tutors, professors, and private coaches, the kind of stage where expensive prep schools flexed their superiority, and as the moderator announced it, this house believes that global free trade agreements do more harm than good to developing nations. A ripple of smug smiles spread across the Ivy League benches, because this was their territory, their playground, and Amara, with her thrifted blazer and homemade notes, looked to them like an amateur about to drown. But what they didn't know was that while they studied case files in marble libraries, Amara had lived the consequences. Of those policies in her own neighborhood, she had watched local factories close down because production was moved overseas. She had seen her mother's wages shrink while big corporations expanded. She had grown up surrounded by the living proof of inequality that their theories only touched on in abstract terms. And so, when it was her turn, she rose again with a calmness that shook the room. And instead of reading statistics in a dry monotone like the Harvard girl before her, she told the story of Mr. Jackson, the corner store owner in her block who had once employed 3 teenagers to stock shelves, but now struggled alone because cheap imports had gutted his business. She spoke of her uncle who lost his job when the steel plant closed and never found stable work again. She painted images so vivid that even the most hardened judges felt the sting of reality creeping into a debate that was supposed to be academic. And then she layered the facts on top of the stories, numbers that she had memorized in late-night sessions, statistics she dug out of free online journals, pieced together with precision, and suddenly, her opponents looked like they were reciting scripts while she looked like she was unveiling truth, raw and undeniable. By the time she finished, the Yale boy who had laughed at her earlier was flipping frantically through his notes, desperate for a counter that didn't sound hollow. But his rebuttal fell flat, a jumble of theories disconnected from human experience. And when he sat down, red-faced, the audience murmured, some even clapped softly, though it wasn't supposed to be a clapping round, and Amara sat back, her heart hammering, knowing she had landed her first real blow. But the Ivy League pride was stubborn. They weren't ready to admit defeat, and in the next round they came at her with a different tactic. Mockery disguised as intellectual superiority. The Harvard girl smiling sweetly before saying, "While our opponent gives touching anecdotes, this is a debate, not a diary reading." And the crowd chuckled. But Amara did not flinch. She leaned forward, looked the girl straight in the eye, and replied, "And yet your policies are written for people whose lives you reduce to anecdotes. The difference is I give them names and faces." And the chuckle died, replaced by a gasp, the kind of sound an audience makes when a truth, too, sharp cuts through pretension. Round after round, Amara's confidence grew, but so did the hostility. Whispers of, "How is she doing this?" spread among the Ivy benches, coaches frowning, teams huddling tighter, and yet the more they underestimated her, the more dangerous she became, because she was not just debating them, she was holding up a mirror, forcing them to see the emptiness of their privilege, and though the scoreboard had not yet been revealed, everyone in the room could feel it. The girl, they laughed, at was now their biggest threat, and the cracks in their Ivy League pride were beginning to show. By the time the semifinals arrived, the air in the auditorium was electric, every eye fixed on Amara, no longer the unknown underdog, but the storm no one saw coming. And the Ivy League debaters, once so confident, now whispered nervously, plotting how to take her down. Yet destiny had one more twist waiting, because the motion announced was not about trade, economics, or law, but about morality itself. This house believes that privilege creates blindness to truth. And when the words rang out, it was as though the universe had chosen the battlefield just for her. Because who else but Amara could speak on that with the weight of lived reality, and though her opponents tried desperately to twist the motion, arguing definitions and theories, she stood, her voice trembling at first, then rising like a wave, telling the story of her neighborhood, her school with broken windows, her mother stitching clothes into the night, her own fear of walking into rooms like this and being laughed at for daring to exist. And then she looked straight at the Ivy, Stars, her voice steady now, and said, "Privilege is laughing before someone even speaks. Blindness is assuming worth is tied to wealth, but truth belongs to whoever dares to speak it, even if their voice shakes." And in that moment the crowd erupted, not in polite applause, but in thunder, in stomps, in shouts, and the judges sat still, shaken, because never had a debate felt less like competition and more like revelation. And Amara, the girl in the thrifted blazer, had broken through every wall they built around themselves. The final round was almost ceremonial, because though the scoreboard would later confirm it, everyone already knew the outcome, yet the Ivy League stars, bruised in pride, made one last attempt, throwing every rehearsed argument, every polished trick at her. But it was too late. Amara had already won the room. And when she closed with her final words, she did not just win a debate, she rewrote the narrative. "You laughed at me because you believed pride was your armor. But pride without humility is fragile." And tonight it shattered, and silence followed, heavy, undeniable, until the head judge rose and announced her victory, the hall exploding in cheers. And in that instant, Amara did not just defeat the Ivy League stars, she dismantled their illusion of superiority. She proved that brilliance is not owned by privilege, and as she walked off the stage, clutching her folder, tears in her eyes, the same stars who once laughed sat in silence, their pride shredded before the world.